Welcome to Bedtime's sleepy historian sparkles. Here, history isn't loud or rushed, it whispers. Tonight, we step into the hidden lives of Roman slave women, the mothers, healers, laborers, and silent rebels who bore the weight of an empire in kitchens, fields, and unseen corners. These are stories of endurance, courage, and quiet defiance, told slowly and gently to carry you back in time while you relax or drift into sleep. Dizzy if you enjoy history as a calm, immersive journey, subscribe to Bedtime's Sleepy Historian so you never miss a story. Tap the bell icon to join each peaceful exploration of the past. Globe show in Europe, Africa, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Share it in the comments and be part of our global community of history lovers. Chains of the Empire. In the vast sprawl of the Roman Empire, where marble temples gleamed and senators debated in gilded halls, countless lives unfolded in shadow, lives of women bound not by marriage or family, but by chains. They were slave women, the unseen foundation upon which Rome's grandeur rested. Their stories seldom found parchment, yet they were written in sweat, blood, and silence. A Roman slave woman could be found anywhere. In patrician households, she swept atriums, tended infants, spun wool by lamplight. In taverns, she carried jugs of wine heavier than her frame, bowing under the laughter of men. On estates, she trudged through fields from sunrise to dusk, binding wheat or pressing olives. Some were purchased as concubines, their bodies treated as commodities. Others were forced into brothels, their youth traded for profit. To endure was both necessity and art. A slave woman learned when to keep her gaze lowered, when silence offered safety. She memorized the moods of her master, calculated the cost of a word spoken or withheld. Yet beneath obedience lay strategies for survival, small acts of resistance, quiet alliances with other women, hidden moments of rest carved out in the brief hush of night. There were cruelties, yes, beatings, hunger, and punishments designed to break the spirit. But there was also endurance, a strength not sung by poets, but carried in the backbreaking work of survival. And in rare moments there was hope. Some women earned manumission, freedom purchased with years of toil or granted in the master's will. Others clung to faith, to friendships, or to the simple act of raising children in defiance of despair. The Roman world celebrated its victories with arches and triumphs. But its true weight was borne on the backs of those who had no voice, among them, countless slave women, enduring the hardest lives in silence that still echoes through history. The household bonds. Behind the ornate doors of Roman villas, where painted frescoes brightened the walls and fountains trickled in shaded courtyards, lived the women whose labor made such splendor possible. Household slave women formed the quiet machinery of domestic life. To a guest, their presence was near invisible. Food appeared, garments were mended, floors gleamed, but to the women who performed these tasks, every day was a cycle of unrelenting toil. A young ancilla might be tasked with waking before dawn, sweeping away yesterday's ashes, and rekindling the household hearth before her mistress stirred. Others tended the kitchen, grinding grain by hand into flour, a task so endless it carved grooves into their palms. The more skilled were seamstresses, hairdressers, or attendants who followed their mistress everywhere, even into the baths, ever ready with oils and combs. Yet proximity to the mistress was not safety. A displeased lady could punish her maid with a slap, a harsh word, or worse, sell her away, severing friendships and family bonds with the stroke of a stylus. The intimacy of service carried constant peril, for a slave woman's body and fate belonged not to herself, but to the household. Still, within these marble halls, women carved out secret networks. A cook whispered advice to the young maid on how to avoid the steward's wrath. A wet nurse cradled not only her master's infant but sang lullabies from her own village, keeping alive a memory of home. A maidservant, skilled with the needle, might quietly stitch a hidden symbol into her garment, a reminder that she was more than property. These small acts mattered. They created a kind of invisible resistance, a thread of dignity woven through lives meant to be erased. In the wealthiest villas, guests admired mosaics of heroes and gods, but the truest survival stories belonged to the women who swept the very stones those mosaics were laid upon. The silent burden. If household labor was relentless, the unspoken burden of a slave woman's life was often her body. In Rome, a master's authority extended not just to a woman's work but to her flesh. Concubinage was common, and a slave woman might find herself summoned at night, not as a companion but as an object of ownership. Consent had no place in such arrangements, and silence became her shield. Some slave women were bought for this very purpose, their youth or beauty assessed in markets as coldly as one might examine a horse. Others were thrust into brothels, their earnings flowing not into their hands but into the purses of those who owned them. Their value was measured in coin, their humanity disregarded. Yet even in this darkest of realities, women sought ways to endure. A few wielded what small influence they could, securing better treatment for themselves or protection for their children. Children born of such unions occupied a precarious place. Legally, they too were slaves, owned by the same household. But sometimes, especially if the father was the master himself, a child might be freed, altering the fate of an entire lineage. Among slave women, whispered advice passed like contraband: how to avoid a master's notice, how to appease his wife if jealousy flared, how to shield a daughter from the same fate. Friendship became lifeline, a network of quiet solidarity within walls that sought to divide. Roman poets occasionally spoke of love between master and slave, dressing domination in verses of affection. But for most women, there was no poetry, only survival in the face of exploitation, only the ability to endure what could not be refused. And yet, survival itself was an act of defiance. Each woman who carried on, who lived despite the empire's weight, bore within her a resilience unrecorded in Roman triumphs but written into the hidden annals of endurance. Toiling in the fields. Beyond Rome's grand villas and bustling streets stretched the countryside, where vast estates fed the empire's appetite. Here, slave women labored under the open sky, their days marked not by the hours of a sundial, but by the unyielding demands of the land. At dawn, the overseer's call dragged them from straw mats and cramped quarters. They trudged barefoot into fields damp with dew, scythes in hand. Some bent low to gather olives, staining their fingers with oil. Others pressed grapes in deep vats, their legs aching as they stomped in rhythm until the juice ran thick. Wheat, too, was women's work, cutting stalks, binding sheaves, and carrying them to storage. The toil was endless, the rewards non-existent. Overseers, often slaves themselves, desperate to prove loyalty, showed no mercy. A woman who faltered in the summer sun risked the lash. Hunger was constant, for rations were meager, barely enough to sustain such labor. And yet, in the brief spaces between tasks, women wove fragments of life. They sang work songs from their homelands, their voices blending across the furrows. They shared scraps of bread or figs pilfered from orchards, whispering jokes or memories to lighten the weight. At dusk, when the sky bled gold, they gathered by the fire to mend clothes, braid each other's hair, and pass along news of a birth, of a punishment, of a dream of freedom. The land was merciless, but it also offered tiny refuges. A wildflower tucked behind the ear, a stolen moment to gaze at the horizon, a child cradled at the edge of a vineyard, all these were small rebellions against despair. For in the fields, slave women endured not only for themselves but for the children who might, with luck or fortune, inherit a different life. The bread on a Roman table, the wine in a senator's cup, the oil in a sacred lamp, all bore the hidden fingerprints of these women, whose strength sustained an empire that never spoke their names. The market of flesh. Long before a slave woman scrubbed a villa's floors or bent beneath the sunlit fields, many first passed through Rome's markets of flesh. These were places where lives were measured, priced, and exchanged as casually as sacks of grain. Beneath makeshift awnings or in public squares, rows of women stood on wooden platforms, their fates in the hands of buyers who circled like vultures. Merchants displayed their stock with calculated cruelty. Plaques hung from the women's necks listed their origins, ages, skills, and defects. Good for weaving, one sign might proclaim. Healthy for bearing children, another. A woman's accent, her scars, the set of her shoulders, all were weighed and judged. Buyers were ruthless in their inspections. They pinched arms to test for strength, forced mouths open to check teeth, even stripped women bare to appraise their bodies without shame. For those being sold, the humiliation was worse than chains. It was the reduction of a life, every memory, every hope, into coin. The market was not only a place of degradation but of dread. Women feared separation most. A mother might watch her child led away by another buyer, powerless to intervene. Sisters were torn apart, lovers scattered. Rome did not deal in families, it dealt in property. And yet, even here, sparks of resistance flickered. Some women met buyers' eyes with a defiant stare, a silent refusal to be broken. Others whispered encouragement to those beside them, reminding each other that survival was still possible. A lucky few were purchased into gentler households, or by masters who, in time, would grant freedom. But for most, the market was the beginning of a lifetime of servitude. The clink of coins, the shuffle of sandals, the laughter of traders, these sounds drowned the cries of women whose names would never enter Rome's records. To the empire, they were inventory. To themselves, they were simply enduring, carrying within them the stories that history forego. Mothers in chains. For many slave women, the heaviest burden was not the lash nor the labor, but the cruel uncertainty of motherhood. To bear a child in bondage was to love with fear, for in Roman law, the fate of a newborn was not tied to the father, but to the mother's status. If she was a slave, so too was the child. Thus, every lullaby sung in the dark carried the echo of chains. Some children were taken at birth, raised not by their mothers but by wet nurses or sold into other households before they could even walk. Others remained beside their mothers, toddling through kitchens or vineyards, learning early how to fetch water, grind grain, or mind younger siblings. Love blossomed despite the shackles, yet always under the shadow of loss. At any moment, a master could decide to sell a child away, severing bonds as easily as cutting a thread. Yet even within this cruel system, mothers found ways to resist despair. They whispered ancestral stories into little ears, keeping alive the languages and traditions of distant homelands. They taught their children skills that might one day win favor or freedom, weaving, healing, or tending the fields with care. Some mothers bore children by their masters, a reality that carried both peril and possibility. Such children, though still legally slaves, were sometimes granted freedom or special treatment. For the mother, this fragile thread of hope could mean enduring humiliation in silence, clinging to the possibility that her child's fate might rise above her own. Roman writers praised the virtues of freeborn matrons, chaste, devoted, honorable. Yet the truest endurance belonged to the women whose virtues were never celebrated, whose sacrifices were unacknowledged. Slave mothers carry not only the weight of their labor, but the immeasurable pain of uncertain futures for those they loved most. And still they sang. Soft songs hummed as they rocked infants on their knees, melodies of comfort in a world that had denied them everything but the strength to keep going. The weight of punishment. In the Roman world, discipline for slaves was not bound by fairness or law, but by the whim of masters and overseers. For slave women, the threat of punishment lingered like a shadow, a constant reminder that their bodies were never their own. A dropped jug of wine, a child who cried too loudly in the night, a loaf of bread stolen in hunger, any of these could bring harsh consequences. Some punishments were meant to sting and pass, slaps, beatings, extra tasks. Others carried deeper scars. Whippings tore the skin, branding irons marked a woman's flesh, and chains confined her to dark corners until her spirit bent beneath the weight of silence. The humiliation was as cutting as the pain. A woman punished in front of others became a warning to her companions. The overseer's lash was not only a tool of discipline, but of spectacle, meant to remind all present of their place. And yet, within this brutal system, women found astonishing resilience. They comforted each other in whispered tones, washing wounds with stolen scraps of cloth, binding bruises with herbs gathered in secret. They learned how to endure with dignity, lowering their eyes when commanded, but never letting go of the ember of defiance glowing within. Some women resisted in quiet ways. They moved slowly when ordered to hurry, stretched out small tasks, or concealed bits of food to share among friends. Others took bolder risks, breaking tools, sabotaging chores, even slipping away in the night in hopes of freedom. Each act, however small, was a rebellion against a world that sought to crush their will. Roman law claimed that slaves were property, not people. But every punished woman bore the truth of her humanity in her pain, her endurance, and her refusal to let cruelty erase her. The empire may have branded her as less than human, yet her every heartbeat defied the claim. The fragile door to freedom. Though most slave women lived and died in bondage, there existed a fragile door that sometimes swung open, manumission, the granting of freedom. For a woman who had known only servitude, the very word libertas shimmered like a distant star. Freedom could come in many ways. A master, softened by age or gratitude, might free a loyal servant in his will. Others allowed a woman to purchase her freedom with years of savings, coins painstakingly gathered from tips, small trades, or sympathetic patrons. Some women were freed for bearing their master's children, a reluctant recognition of their role in the household's legacy. Manumission did not always bring equality. A free woman, Liberta, remained tied to her former master through obligations of loyalty and service. She carried the stigma of her past, her status forever shadowed by the mark of slavery. Yet for many, the shift was profound. A free woman could marry legally, own property, and raise her children with a future that did not automatically begin in chains. There are fragments of their stories scattered across tombstones, where freed women proudly inscribed their names beside their husbands and children. A stone might read, "To Valeria, freed woman, faithful wife and mother." Such inscriptions were acts of triumph, proof that endurance had blossomed into a legacy. Still, the path was narrow, and freedom was often bittersweet. To leave behind fellow slaves was to carry survivors' guilt. Some women, though free, returned to visit friends still bound in kitchens and fields, offering gifts or coins in secret. Others tried to buy the freedom of their own children or siblings, stretching their hard-won liberty even further. In the grand mosaic of Rome, freed women were rare tiles, bright, visible, but surrounded by countless others still trapped in darkness. Their existence proved that freedom was possible, yet also cruelly selective. For every woman who gained liberty, thousands remained behind, whispering lullabies of hope into the silence of their chains. Healers in the shadows. Among the countless tasks forced upon slave women, one role stood apart, that of the healer. Whether trained formally in a household or carrying wisdom from her homeland, a slave woman who knew remedies held a rare and fragile power. In the kitchens, she brewed teas from fennel and chamomile to soothe fevers. In the fields, she pressed poultices of garlic and honey into wounds from the overseer's lash. Some learned midwifery, guiding births not only for fellow slaves but for their mistress herself, steadying hands that cradled both despair and new life. These women walked a fine line. A skilled healer could become invaluable, earning favor or gentler treatment. But mistakes, or suspicions of witchcraft, could bring swift punishment. A failed cure might mean a beating, while a successful one could paradoxically inspire fear, as masters mistrusted knowledge they did not understand. Among their fellow slaves, however, these women were guardians. They whispered secrets of herbs, sage for aching joints, rue for cramps, poppy for sleep. They passed down remedies in songs and stories, hiding healing knowledge in lullabies so it could not be stripped away. A child with a cough, an old woman with failing eyes, a man limping from labor, all found comfort in their care. For the enslaved, medicine was not just about mending the body but preserving the spirit. To treat a fever with a simple infusion was to declare that life still mattered, even when the empire insisted it did not. Healing became a form of quiet resistance, a way of restoring dignity where it had been denied. Roman authors wrote treatises on medicine, praising Galen and Hippocrates. But they never recorded the hands of the slave women who mixed herbs in the dim corners of kitchens or pressed cool cloths to the brows of weeping children. Yet it was these women who sustained life in silence, healers in the shadows of an empire that refused to name them. Sisterhood in chains. In a world designed to divide and silence them, slave women wove bonds of sisterhood that gave meaning to survival. Their friendships were born in kitchens, fields, and cramped sleeping quarters, stitched together in whispers and shared burdens. By day, they labored side by side, passing tools, trading fragments of advice, and shielding one another when tempers flared from above. One woman might distract the overseer while another snatched a crust of bread. A mother unable to nurse her child found another willing to cradle the infant to her breast. These were not grand acts of rebellion, but quiet exchanges of care that made endurance possible. At night, when the household slept, they gathered in shadows. Around small fires or in the corners of storerooms, they braided each other's hair, sang lullabies from distant lands, or traced symbols of protection in the dirt. Some carved tiny marks on walls, secret signs that only their sisters understood, tokens of belonging in a life stripped of names. Sisterhood was also a shield. When punishment fell on one, the others tended wounds, washed blood from garments, and whispered strength back into broken spirits. They carried one another through grief, too, when children were taken or loved ones sold. To mourn together was to resist the empire's attempt to turn them into silent objects. And in rare moments of laughter, they reclaimed pieces of themselves. A joke told while grinding grain, a song shared while drawing water, these were sparks of joy that no lash could extinguish. In each other, they found humanity reflected back, proof that they were more than the property Rome tried to make them. Rome's historians wrote of empires, armies, and emperors. But the truest legacies of resilience were held in these unseen networks of women, bound not by chains alone but by the unbreakable thread of care. Their sisterhood was a quiet rebellion, an insistence on life, dignity, and love beneath the empire's weight. Faith beneath the yoke. When chains cut too deeply and labor seemed unending, many slave women turned to faith, whether in the gods of Rome, the spirits of their homelands, or quiet rituals whispered in secrecy. Spiritual life offered them something Rome could never own: hope. In wealthy households, slave women often accompanied their mistresses to temples, carrying offerings of incense or garlands of flowers. There they stood at the edges, bowing before statues of Juno, Venus, or Minerva. Some prayed earnestly, believing these goddesses might hear their pleas. Others mouthed the words but kept their true devotions hidden, calling silently to the gods of rivers, forests, or ancestors left behind across the seas. In the fields and slave quarters, worship was more intimate. A scrap of cloth tied to a tree, a handful of grain scattered on the earth, or a whispered prayer under the stars, these small acts became lifelines. Mothers prayed over their children, asking for strength and protection. Friends clasped hands before punishment, begging unseen powers for mercy. With the spread of new faiths, some women found comfort in gatherings of early Christians, who preached that all souls were equal before God. The message of salvation and freedom beyond death resonated deeply with those whose daily lives knew no freedom at all. For these women, baptismal waters washed away, if only for a moment, the brand of slavery. Yet even without temples or preachers, faith endured. Songs became prayers, herbs carried in pockets became charms, and dreams were interpreted as messages from beyond. Religion was not only about hope for divine rescue but about endurance, finding meaning in suffering and a promise, however faint, that justice might lie beyond the reach of Rome's whip. Though their names were not inscribed on temple walls, the prayers of slave women filled the empire's air like invisible incense. Their faith, whether in Roman gods or the spirits of forgotten homelands, was a quiet rebellion, an insistence that even in chains, their souls remained free. Chained for spectacle. Not all slave women toiled in kitchens or fields. Some were forced into the world of entertainment, their lives turned into spectacles for the amusement of others. Rome, with its hunger for diversion, made stages and arenas into prisons no less harsh than chains. In private villas, slave women performed music, playing lyres or flutes as their masters dined. Their melodies floated through halls filled with laughter and wine, but their songs were not their own. They were commanded to perform, and even beauty became a kind of bondage, as skill made them valuable yet never free. Others were dancers, trained to move gracefully for the pleasure of guests. Some entertained at feasts, spinning in circles of applause and drunken jeers, their movements admired yet their personhood dismissed. For some, their performances blurred into exploitation, their bodies treated as both art and possession. The most tragic were those sold into public degradation, forced into brothels disguised as theaters, or made to participate in mock spectacles. A few women were even thrown into the arena, not as gladiators with armor and fame, but as victims in staged punishments, dressed as mythical figures and slain for show. To the crowd, it was entertainment. To the woman, it was the end. And yet, even within this cruel theater, moments of defiance emerged. A singer might weave her homeland's songs into Roman feasts, preserving memory beneath the veneer of performance. A dancer might share secret glances of solidarity with fellow slaves, their silent understanding stronger than the crowd's gaze. The Romans prided themselves on their culture, on the refinement of art and spectacle. Yet so often, its foundation rested on the unseen suffering of enslaved women who were compelled to make beauty out of bondage. Their voices, their steps, their very lives filled Rome's nights with sound and movement, and vanished unrecorded, save for the echo of endurance in silence. Whispers of rebellion. Though Rome's laws, chains, and whips pressed heavily on them, slave women were not merely silent sufferers. In hidden ways, sometimes small, sometimes fierce, they resisted. Their rebellions rarely made the chronicles of Roman historians, but they lived in whispered stories, in broken tools, in vanished footsteps at dawn. Some resistance was quiet, woven into the fabric of daily life. A woman might move slowly when commanded to hurry, pour watered wine for a cruel master, or feign ignorance when given an order. These small acts, invisible to outsiders, were ways of reclaiming a fragment of control. Others risked more daring defiance. In kitchens, women might slip herbs into food, not enough to kill, but enough to sicken an overseer, buying themselves a day of lighter work. In fields, they might scatter seeds carelessly, spoiling the harvest of those who claimed ownership of their labor. Stories lingered of women who ran away, vanishing into the countryside, joining bands of fugitives who survived on the empire's edges. Perhaps the most powerful rebellion lay in preserving what Rome sought to erase: their humanity. To sing the songs of their mothers, to teach children the words of their ancestral tongue, to braid hair in the old styles, these were acts of cultural survival, defiant declarations that Rome could not own their souls. Occasionally, resistance flared into open revolt. The great slave uprisings, like the one led by Spartacus, were remembered in Roman records, but even in these, the voices of women were muted. Yet they were there, tending the wounded, carrying messages, sometimes even taking up weapons. Their courage flickered in the chaos, proof that even in chains, the desire for freedom burned. Rome celebrated its triumphs in marble and bronze. But in the quiet defiance of women who refused to be broken, another kind of triumph endured, one unwritten, uncelebrated, yet no less real. The empire could command their bodies, but never fully command their will. Echoes of an unseen legacy. Though Rome left little record of them, the legacy of slave women rippled through every layer of the empire. Their labor sustained households, their songs filled the silence of kitchens, their hands raised children who would one day inherit both chains and freedom. Though unacknowledged, they shaped Rome in ways its senators and poets never could. The freeborn matron, praised in marble statues, leaned on the toil of enslaved attendants who spun her wool, dressed her in silk, and bathed her children. The grain that fed Rome's markets passed through the hands of women bent low in distant fields. The very olive oil that lit temples and sanctuaries often came from presses worked by women who sang lullabies as they labored, their prayers mingling with the groan of the stone wheels. Even freedom, when it came to a few, carried forward their strength. Free women became midwives, seamstresses, innkeepers, and sometimes wealthy patrons in their own right. Their children, no longer born into chains, carried names and lives that might have seemed impossible to their mothers. Tombstones tell fragments of this story, inscriptions carved with pride by freed women for their families, testaments of survival against impossible odds. And though most names were lost, their influence lingered quietly in the households they shaped. A slave woman who raised her master's child left her imprint on Rome's future elite. A wet nurse, soothing an infant destined for power, planted seeds of comfort and resilience in souls that would never know her by name. The empire saw them as shadows, but shadows leave outlines, faint yet enduring. Their lives shaped Rome's daily rhythm, the hum of kitchens, the hush of nurseries, the songs carried across vineyards at dusk. And while history praised emperors and generals, the truest endurance belonged to the women who survived in silence, their legacy written not in marble but in the persistence of life itself. A whisper beyond time. If one listens closely, beneath the thunder of Rome's legions and the proclamations of emperors, there is another sound, soft, steady, almost forgotten. It is the whisper of slave women, carried across centuries, like the rustle of fabric in the night. Their lives were rarely written, but they were lived with strength that outlasted their chains. They endured fields and kitchens, punishments and loss, and yet, in the small moments, they claimed pieces of humanity, a quiet song while grinding grain, a secret smile shared with another woman by the well, a whispered story told to a child who might one day be free. Rome celebrated marble arches and golden victories, but the true foundation of its greatness was not stone. It was the backs of the unseen, the hands of the nameless, the endurance of women who gave more than they could ever keep. They were shadows in their own time, yet their shadows stretch still, reminding us that history is not only built by the powerful, but also carried by those who were never meant to be remembered. And so, when we speak of Rome, we must also speak of them, the women who bore its burdens, who stitched together its daily life, who endured with a strength that empires could not erase. They lived in silence, but their endurance remains a story too vast to be forgotten. The echo of forgotten names. Somewhere in Rome's ruins, perhaps beneath a crumbled arch or inside a collapsed cellar, there may lie a shard of pottery once touched by a slave woman's hand. She may have carried water in it, or hidden scraps of bread, or simply brushed her fingers against its clay in passing. That touch, long erased from sight, still lingers in time's memory. Her name is lost, as most were, yet every forgotten name is an echo. Livia, Doria, Marcia, names carried by noblewomen, are preserved in marble inscriptions, while the slave women who raised their children, washed their clothes, and endured their tempers remain unspoken. Still, their presence was woven into every corner of Roman life, in the laughter of children they nursed, in the bread they kneaded, in the sweat that turned stone into monuments. History, for centuries, chose to overlook them. But silence does not mean absence. Their strength survives in fragments, in letters where masters complained of their defiance, in accounts of healers who passed down remedies, in the rare moments when even the elite admitted that their households could not function without the women they kept in bondage. Theirs is not a tale of triumph in the usual sense. It is not the story of victory on a battlefield or the founding of a city. It is something quieter, but no less enduring, the survival of spirit against a world that denied them freedom. And in that survival, they carved out a legacy Rome itself could not fully erase. The quiet rebellion. Rebellion did not always come with fire and steel. For many slave women, it was quieter, subtler, woven into the rhythm of survival. Refusing to work with full effort. Saving scraps of food for a hungry child when the overseer looked away. Teaching a whispered prayer or song from their homeland so that memory might live where freedom could not. To the Romans, these acts might have seemed insignificant, even invisible. But to the women who carried them out, they were declarations of self. Each small choice reminded them that though they were owned in body, their spirit was harder to claim. There are rare glimpses in records, of women who pretended illness to avoid labor, of those who learned enough letters to secretly read, of midwives who preserved herbal remedies in defiance of masters who wanted their skills but not their autonomy. Their resistance was not an open war, it was a hidden war, waged in kitchens, fields, and cramped quarters where no Roman historian thought to look. And yet it mattered. For in those moments of defiance, they were not merely slaves. They were women holding on to dignity, to memory, and to the smallest spark of freedom that even chains could not extinguish. Bonds of sisterhood. In the shadows of Rome's grandeur, slave women often found strength not in solitude but in one another. Theirs was a sisterhood forged not by choice but by survival. Together they shared burdens, whispered advice, and tended wounds, both of the body and of the spirit. When one wept for a child taken away, another would hold her in the dark and remind her she was not alone. When one faltered under exhaustion, another might carry a little extra weight, or slip her a crust of bread saved from her own meager portion. These small mercies did not erase suffering, but they made it bearable. It was in these bonds that fragments of joy could still be found. Laughter stolen during washing at the river. Stories told in low voices while mending clothes. Songs hummed in accents that carried traces of distant homelands. In these moments, they became more than what Rome demanded of them. They became women, friends, mothers, dreamers. Empires celebrated victories carved in marble, but the true victories were softer, hidden in the daily courage of women who found ways to remind each other that they were still human. And perhaps that was their greatest defiance of all. The weight of endurance. The lives of Roman slave women were measured not in accolades or monuments, but in endurance. Every dawn brought labor, every night brought exhaustion, yet each day was survived. Their bodies bore the weight of Rome, their hands carried the burden of its household wealth, their hearts held hope where the law allowed none. Even in despair, they found reasons to persevere. A child's laughter, the comfort of a friend, a stolen moment of song, these fragments of life became anchors. Some women dreamed of freedom, imagining a life where their children would walk unshackled, where their labor would not define their worth. Others found solace in ritual, in prayer, in the quiet rhythms of daily tasks performed with care despite hardship. History often erases the invisible labor that sustains civilizations. But the endurance of these women is undeniable. It was not the triumph of conquest, but the triumph of survival. Every meal prepared, every child soothed, every field tilled, every wound tended, these were victories written in sweat and patience, invisible to the empire but recorded in the lineage of life itself. And as the empire's legions marched, as senators argued, as marble monuments rose, it was the silent persistence of slave women that made Rome's world function at all. Their stories were not celebrated, but they were essential, and their strength resonates still. Shadows that endure. Rome's grandest temples crumble, its statues erode, and emperors fade into memory. Yet, in the quiet spaces between, in kitchens, fields, and hidden corners, the lives of slave women continue to echo. Their names may be lost, their faces unknown, but their endurance remains, a testament not to empire, but to the strength of the human spirit. They lived without choice, yet carved meaning from labor. They suffered injustices that history seldom records, yet discovered ways to resist and survive. They bore children in bondage, yet instilled hope and knowledge that outlived chains. They sang, healed, comforted, whispered, and remembered, creating a legacy that no marble could immortalize. In their silence lies poetry. In their resilience, a quiet rebellion. Rome may have tried to erase them, but their spirits persist in every whisper of wind through ancient ruins, in every grain pressed, every cloth mended, every child nurtured. The empire's glory rested on their backs, yet it could not claim their dignity. And so, as we look back through time, we see not only the emperors and battles, but the invisible threads that held it all together. The slave women of Rome were unseen architects of endurance, shadows that carried the weight of civilization while keeping their humanity intact. Their story is one of survival, courage, and quiet triumph, a reminder that even in chains, the human spirit can endure, leaving traces that whisper across the centuries. Their legacy is ours to remember,